December 5th, 1989, a month after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a short, shy man in a Soviet uniform came out to the German protesters who had gathered at the KGB building in Dresden. He introduced himself as an ordinary interpreter and warned the people against seizing the building, threatening armed resistance. The man looked nervous and tired. Unsurprisingly, the previous night, he and his colleagues had been burning secret documents in the furnace so that information about the KGB's activities in Germany would not be revealed to the world. This man was Vladimir Putin. Who knows? Maybe it was then that his fear of the expression of the people's will was formed, which he, as a typical Soviet functionary, did not understand. A fear he has been struggling with all his life. Over 24 years of rule, the personality of the president of Russia has been perceived diametrically differently. Some call him the most powerful person on the planet. For others, he is the embodiment of the concepts dictator, tyrant, and evil. So let's figure out what Putin is really afraid of, why he is not the most influential person in the world, and why the Russian president does not flush the toilet after himself. Before we get to the most interesting part, please subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you so much. The young Vladimir Putin began his career in St. Petersburg, which was then called Leningrad. From childhood, he dreamed of becoming an intelligence officer, so after studying at the university, he joined the KGB. There he worked for 10 years in the 5th Ideological Department of the KGB, monitoring foreign tourists. Later, having proven his loyalty on the spot, he was given the opportunity to work in the GDR, the eastern part of modern Germany, which was controlled by the USSR. Officially, he was an employee of the House of Soviet-German Friendship. Unofficially, he was engaged in recruiting agents and espionage. Perhaps it was there that the future dictator laid the foundations of his understanding of how the state system should work. The level of control in East Germany was almost as strict as in the USSR. The GDR Secret Service, the Stasi, kept an eye on practically every GDR citizen. Clearly, such centralization of power appealed greatly to Putin, who was raised by the secret services. But the Germans thought differently. In the late 1980s, the population of the GDR advocated for the liberalization of the regime and the opening of borders with the FRG, the part of Germany controlled by the West. The pro-Soviet leadership, of course, resisted in every way. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Hundreds of families, relatives, and mere acquaintances who had been separated for 28 whole years were finally together. But this was only the beginning. In December 1989, people in Dresden, as in all East Germany, demanded the liquidation of the Stasi. Rallies were held near the headquarters of the Secret Service. Angry people wanted to get not so much to the employees, but to the archives of the special services, because there the atrocities of the Stasi were recorded, as well as lists of people who collaborated with the regime. Vladimir Putin spoke about this event in many interviews.
Миссия переговорщика была у меня, да, я вышел к людям, спросил, чего бы они хотели. Они сказали, что хотели бы досмотреть здание. Я ответил, что это здание принадлежит советской армии, оно не подлежит досмотру в соответствии с межправсоглашением.
The president of the Russian Federation recounted how he spent hours burning the archive in the furnace. They were afraid that after the Stasi headquarters, the protesters would come to them too. And the KGB had no fewer interesting documents on recruited agents. Sometime later, several dozen protesters did indeed approach the building. Putin had to conduct negotiations with the crowd, calling himself an ordinary interpreter. He said that there was an armed security in the building with orders to open fire if anyone broke in. This was a lie. The security was demoralized, and the KGB leadership, like the nearby military unit, could not give a clear answer on what to do. These events clearly left a huge mark on Putin's memory. Vladimir, whom his colleagues nicknamed Moth, experienced tremendous stress, the impact of which stayed with him for life. The official propaganda quickly created a legend out of this event, that Putin allegedly came out with a gun and was ready to defend the KGB building to the last cartridge. But reality tells us otherwise. For the rest of his life, Putin retained an animal fear of any uncontrolled expression of the will of the people, such as rallies, demonstrations, riots, etc. That is why mass gatherings and unsanctioned rallies are prohibited in Russia. You cannot even hold a clean white placard when standing on a square. Within 5 minutes, you will be taken away. Another of Putin's fears is the loss of the power he gained 24 years ago. There are several reasons for this. An interesting feature of Russian history is the Russians' penchant for cults of personality and for coups, the violent change of power. Every head of state initially surrounded himself with the most trusted people who assured him of their loyalty. And then, after a certain period of time, they betrayed him, putting someone from their own circle in charge. Putin did the same. After he took the position of acting president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir brought his closest circle to power. These are his childhood friends from school, university, as well as criminal authorities with whom he began his ascent in Leningrad. Here's an interesting document. In it, you can see a list of owners of the land plot called the Ozero Cooperative. Vladimir Putin is on this list. And now the most interesting part. Everyone on this list either held or still holds the highest positions in the state apparatus or controls the largest businesses in Russia. At one point, even Putin's drivers became governors. He simply had no one else left that he trusted. Such appointments can also be called a reason why Russia has degraded in all aspects of life over all these years. Putin appoints people not for their intellectual or scientific abilities, but on the principle of loyalty to the Tsar. The president. In other words, it doesn't matter how effective you were in your position, you just must show your devotion to the current regime. Of course, not everyone agrees to live in the system that Putin is imposing on Russians. As early as 1992, an investigation was conducted into the future president's fraudulent activities in the Resources for Food program. This was a period when Russia was not receiving loans because its currency had devalued. Instead, Moscow was forced to exchange its resources for the goods it needed: food, technology, machinery, etc. Putin, who at the time oversaw foreign affairs in Leningrad, issued fake permits to participate in the program to people who had good connections with him. In return, either nothing or only a minimal part of what was agreed upon was imported into Russia. This was even reported in the newspapers under the headline, "KGB Colonel Causing Poverty and Hunger in St. Petersburg." But the world was not destined to find out about this. The case was first delayed and then dropped. This was done by Dmitry Medvedev, also an ally of Putin. Maria Salye, the investigator on this case, later moved out of the city to the countryside and died of natural causes. But not everyone was so fortunate, because another of Putin's fears is people over whom he has no influence. According to the logic of the former head of the FSB, if a person does not say what he needs to hear, then they should not speak at all. In 2006, in London, Alexander Litvinenko, who claimed Putin's direct involvement in the apartment bombings of the 2000s that led to the Second Chechen War, was poisoned with the radioactive substance polonium-210. Doctors were unable to save the former FSB officer, and Scotland Yard was able to reconstruct, down to the minute, who was involved in poisoning the opposition figure. Imagine, the perpetrator of the murder, Andrei Lugovoy, is currently a sitting deputy of the State Duma of the Russian Federation. In February 2015, opposition politician Boris Nemtsov was killed just a few hundred meters from the Kremlin. One of the authors of the Russian Constitution in the early 1990s and initially a supporter of Putin, Nemtsov became one of the active opponents of the Russian dictator's regime. The day after the assassination, the opposition figure was to present a report on the presence of Russian troops in the Ukrainian Donbass in 2014 to 2015. In August 2020, opposition leader and businessman Alexei Navalny, who actively criticized Vladimir Putin, was poisoned with Novichok nerve gas. In 2018, they also tried to poison Sergei Skripal, a former Russian intelligence officer who fled to the UK, with a similar gas. Both poisonings failed. In January 2021, Navalny returned to Russia. This was a mistake. He was imprisoned, where he died in February 2024. These are just the most high-profile examples of opposition figures who were eliminated by the Russian authorities. There were also businessmen, journalists, human rights activists. All of them are united by an active position in the fight against the system of power that currently exists in Russia. The system of power headed by Vladimir Putin. A powerful blow at the Russian dictator was also the betrayal of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Putin's former chef, Prigozhin at one point began to spread Russia's influence around the world, particularly in Africa. This was done through the private military company Wagner. It was engaged in destabilizing situations in African countries, from seizing precious metal deposits to overthrowing governments. During the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Wagner PMC was one of the most capable units, recruiting former prisoners and retired military personnel into its ranks. Eventually, Prigozhin increasingly criticized the tactics of the Russian Defense Ministry and Putin himself. On June 24th, Wagner PMC columns marched on Moscow, also seizing the city of Rostov. Prigozhin was stopped with the help of the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, who mediated between him and Putin. Of course, Putin did not forgive Prigozhin's betrayal. On August 23rd, the plane carrying him and other Wagner PMC leaders was blown up in mid-air. In addition to the fear of losing power and criticism, Vladimir Putin is keenly afraid of losing the most important thing for every person: health. The Russian dictator is already 71, and his entourage is actively engaged in protecting not only his security, but also his immune system. Putin is always accompanied by a staff of doctors, most often an ENT and an oncologist. All world journalists speculate about this, hinting that the aging dictator has or had oncological diseases, throat cancer or pancreatic cancer, which is accompanied by a characteristic cough. Moreover, for the last 5 years, Putin has been accompanied by 2 or more people with a strange suitcase. Their duties are to collect the Russian dictator's excrement. You may ask, why? So that Western intelligence services cannot take samples of Putin's internal secretions and draw conclusions about the state of the President of the Russian Federation's health. Over his considerable lifetime, Vladimir Putin has done many things. He will undoubtedly go down on the pages of history as an authoritarian tyrant who suppressed freedom of speech in his own country, unleashed at least 3 wars, and is responsible for millions of ruined lives. And perhaps that is why he is so afraid of losing power and his life. Because after his death, as after Stalin's, people will be able to fully understand what they have endured.